Recently, a colleague of mine said something that annoyed me. Now, to be fair, this isn't as unusual as it may sound. I get annoyed about a lot of things. Some folks take wonder and awe as their jumping off points for some kind of artistic response. The beauty of a sunset, happy little trees, the smile on a lover's face. Me? I am apparently the grandpa on the TV show The Simpsons, and I will soon be shouting at the neighborhood kids to get off my lawn. Now, in my defense, I prefer to think that I have chosen to not age gracefully. Instead, I have chosen violence. And as the oracle said, know thyself, etc., etc., etc. I'm not always intellectually prickly. I know this is true because sometimes I'm asleep. And sometimes it's really not my fault. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But that is the reason why today's sermon happened. Anyway, my colleague said something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't read those old books. No one reads Emerson. I don't care, seriously. No one cares. Okay, so first, in my personal pantheon of awesome, right after family, friends, and coffee, I have books. I will confess that I am never going to read all of the books I have collected. Don't worry, I am excellent at self-justification. I can cheerfully say that I ascribe to the Japanese philosophy of tsundoku, the art of collecting books you have no intention of reading. Or I could quote the words of St. Augustine, tolle lege. That's Latin for take it up and read. Those are probably tattooed on my soul somewhere. Or I could quote Alfred Edward Norton, who once said, quote, the buying of more books than one can read is nothing less than the soul reaching out towards infinity. But I'm very likely to reference the famous UU saint, Carl of Sagan, who famously said, quote, books are proof that humans are capable of working magic. So when I hear someone say no one should read old books, my brain does a credible interpretation and imitation of a Microsoft Windows computer. Blue screen of death. And I blink until steam comes out of my ears. The worst part of this outlandish disregard from my colleague is how ironic it is. The opening words of Ralph Waldo Emerson's arguably best and most influential essay, titled Nature, which was published in 1836, it begins with the following words. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. We through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition? And a religion by revelation to us, not to the history of theirs. Embosomed for a season in nature, whose floods of life stream around and through us and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned to nature. Why should we grope among the dry bones of the past? Or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. There is more wool and flax in the fields. There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. As many of you may know, we Unitarian Universalists claim Emerson as one of us, and it's true, he was. He was born a Unitarian, born in 1803 to a Unitarian minister, a man named William Emerson. And little Waldo was one of 8 children, one of 8. Biographies of his life say that he was also, quote, the least interesting, least enterprising, and least promising of his siblings. Another biographer notes that, quote, for the first 30 years of his life, Emerson did little to distinguish himself from respectable mediocrity. Ouch. Wow, sounds like some of my guidance counselors. Now, speaking personally, as a child who was early and often identified as gifted and talented by the educational establishment, of whom a great many things were expected and very few happened, I want to say that late blooming is a real thing, and clearly something that most of you who are parents are still clinging to. Don't worry, I see you. I see you. To all outward appearances, young Waldo was not the figure we know today. But he was apparently an avid reader, and over his life had a robust correspondence with others. And anyone interested in doing Emersonian studies, you'll be pleased to note that scholars have 8 volumes of his letters and 16 volumes of his journals, in addition to the 10 volumes of his collected works. As someone who has a tendency towards a certain wordiness, let's just say that I appreciate and applaud Emerson's efforts. Anyway, the point of departure from mediocrity for Emerson was clearly a tragic death, the death of his first wife, Ellen Tucker, who just happens to be a distant relative of mine, I believe. The two had only 2 years together before Ellen died of tuberculosis. And Waldo never really recovered. Shortly after Ellen's death, he quit his job as a Unitarian preacher, sold all of his worldly belongings, and spent the next few years traveling Europe, where he spent considerable time hanging out with the English Romantics, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, John Stuart Mill, and Thomas Carlyle. And it was through them that he was introduced to German philosophy and Eastern religion. So it was that on his return to Massachusetts, he began work on the 100-some page essay we now know as Nature. So, side note here, some of you may be familiar with the Lyceum movement of the early 19th century, where people of modest means and time were able to attend, in person, debates and lectures on politics, science, art, literature, history, and philosophy. And if this sounds rather dull to you today, I'm going to remind you that radio, television, and Netflix were not a thing. And that's probably why the Lyceums were immensely popular. There were thousands of locations across the early part of the 19th century. I wonder if Emerson came to believe that in order to get himself booked at the more profitable venues, what he needed was to make a name for himself. And that enterprising need led him to focus so very thoroughly on a personal brand of poetic provocateur. At this point in American history, Emerson understood that most of American culture was not actually American. The most popular playwrights, the most read poetry, the best-selling novels, the most cited philosophy, even our various then popular versions of Christian religion were not American at all. They were European. What Emerson saw in the Lyceum was an opportunity to bring something different, something original, something American. Why should we grope among the dry bones when he could invent a whole new thing and maybe get rich doing it? That new way was Transcendentalism. Now, that word, Transcendentalism, is a bit of a mouthful. It doesn't refer to a particular system or creed. It's more of a worldview, one that starts with contrasts. The Transcendentalists rejected a lot of things. They rejected the empiricism and skepticism of John Locke and David Hume, two giants of popular and modern philosophy. They also rejected the conservative, Christian, Puritan, boring theology of New England churches. And I think that's a quote. Boring. Yeah. They also rejected most importantly, they wondered out loud if philosophical idealism could match the political idealism of the American founders. Now, that last bit is rather complicated, but the quick and dirty, it goes like this. The Transcendentalists believed that the world around us, all around us, is not the whole story. The work of German idealists like Georg Hegel and Immanuel Kant, they got crossed with these, what we now know as early Hindu, or in America, these Eastern mystical works like the Bhagavad Gita, the Laws of Manu, and the Vedas. This is where those people, the Transcendentalists, found this concept of Maya, right? The idea that our physical world is only a world of illusion, that there is a story behind the story, a reality behind the reality, a truth behind the truth. Of course, philosophers have been talking like this at least since Plato, and Christians have been talking like this at least since the Gnostics. But those ideas and ideals that are real and separate from reality, those were currently under siege from the advances of modern, and I want you to read that as European, science. At a time of growing materialism, a retreat from metaphysics to just physics, the Transcendentalists wondered aloud what lay behind the temporary, the transient, the specific. And instead, they chose to imagine what, if anything, might be permanent, ultimate, universal, true, and real. The folks who joined Emerson on his transcendentalist journey, people like Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Orestes Brownson, Louisa May Alcott, Theodore Parker, Margaret Fuller, Emily Dickinson, and Elizabeth Mary and Sophia Peabody, among many others, including those they heavily influenced, like John Muir, the so-called father of the National Park System, Aldo Leopold, the author of the Sand County Almanac, Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring. Anybody remember that book, Silent Spring? Yeah, powerful. And David Brower, the founder of the Sierra Club. These people, all collectively and individually, they changed the face of American politics, education, culture, and religion, and changed it beyond a way that we are able to undo. So let me try briefly to unpack a few of the ideas of the Transcendentalists, the ones that they poured into this American well. The Transcendentalists tended to believe in God. But this was not the God of their fathers any more than it was God the Father. This God was not personal, not an intimate friend or parental figure judging your moral choices, but something more vast, more alien, but also more present. A God not above all, but in all, an over soul. And something that was, well, everything living was connected to, part of, made whole by. To grasp the true nature of this true divinity, one could find it in, and maybe perhaps better, through nature. Nature was not just a well-dressed stand-in for the holy, the divine, for God. Nature, in some fundamental, mystical, transcendent way, actually was God. A God that you and I could not only commune with, but celebrate with, walk with, and wonder with. Consider this again from Emerson's essay, Nature. Quote, "In the woods, too, a man casts off his years as the snake his skin, and at what period soever of life is always a child. In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God, a decorum and sanctity reign, a perennial festival is dressed, and the guest sees not how he should tire of them in 1,000 years. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There, I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am a part or particle of God. In the wilderness, I find something more precious and fundamental than in the streets or villages. In the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, man beholds something as beautiful as his own inner nature. He certainly had style, didn't he? You have to give him that. You can imagine audiences spellbound listening to this guy talk for over an hour like that. It's really not hard to see why he did so well on the lecture circuit. Anyway, the key for Emerson was human intuition, personal intuition. Again, thinking in terms of contrasts, Emerson wanted to break with authority, break with tradition, do something new. So, tradition, even Christian tradition and books, even the Bible, were obstacles. These relics should not be the arbiters of faith, goodness, and truth. Instead, the only arbiter was you, your gut. You listen to your gut. You listen to your heart. You can pick your body part. Choose your sense experience, but then transcend it. Your soul will know the truth when your body feels it. The material is the gate to the spiritual. You, the true you, the soul, the echo of the oversoul. You, the very image and living hands of a living God, a God of, in, and behind all things. You are the only arbiter of truth, goodness, and beauty that ever mattered. And that is the heart of Emersonian self-reliance. To thine own self be true. It may not be an American invention, but our later wholehearted cultural adoption of it certainly was. A couple years after the publication of Nature, Emerson was invited to address the graduating class of the Harvard Divinity School. Here, he got an opportunity to restate, and refocus his ideas, and in doing so, managed to drop a bomb on both Unitarianism and New England Protestantism. All at one fell swoop, Emerson claimed that Jesus was human, not divine, that true believers didn't need Sunday morning to access higher truths, which is good because priests were irrelevant, worship was boring, sermons were dull, and the teachings and habits of the church were largely harmful to both faith and the faithful, and last but not least, that the sacred cathedral of nature was wildly superior in both importance and in holiness to anything found in the city limits of Boston. Oddly, he was never invited back to Harvard. Okay, time to bring this back around for our friends who were not fond of history or old books. Our Unitarian Universalist principles and sources did not pop out of the head of Zeus like Athena, fully formed, ready for battle. They emerged slowly, and sometimes with great effort. The first principle of Unitarian Universalism, the first of 7, enshrines the idea that human beings have inherent worth and dignity. This statement has nothing to do with market value, monetary policy, the quantification of human productivity, the valuation of human flesh, or the history and politics of American slavery. Our first principle is and has always been a rejection of Calvinism, the Puritan faith that was still very much dominant in New England 50 years after the founding of the nation. And very specifically, it was a rejection both of the doctrine of original sin, the nearly universal assumption in the early years of our American Republic, that human beings from birth were corrupt, beyond redemption, and eternally and utterly deserving of death and punishment. And also a rejection of double predestination. That is the Calvinist doctrine that said that all of us, every human being that ever lived or would ever live, was destined from the beginning of time to either ascend the stairway to heaven or hit the highway to HE double hockey sticks. And if you didn't know which path you were on, guess what? To this, our ancestors said, no thanks, stop freaking people out, and get thee behind me. Us modern UUs inherit that rejection and adopt the affirmation of our most fundamental possibility in two ways. One, from our universalist ancestors, and second, from our transcendentalist ancestors. Two paths, one principle, and that's why it is our first principle. Likewise, our first source of 6 sources that we have chosen to affirm and promote as a denomination is the, quote, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder that moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Direct experience. That comes directly and wholly from transcendentalism. And it's about as Emersonian as you can get without plagiarism. Direct experience, your experience. You must not receive it on a plate or a page. You don't have to accept it on faith. You aren't limited to ancient stories interpreted by some old white-haired bearded dude in glasses. No, you are invited to go forth and bathe in the glory of the heavens themselves. And best of all, it's not hard to do. In Emerson's words, quote, if the stars should appear only one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God which they had been shown? But instead, every night comes out these envoys of beauty and light the universe with their admonishing smile. For Emerson and for all of those of us who have followed him, we don't need an invitation to the most glorious party in all of existence because you are that party. And everywhere you go, everywhere you are, everywhere you look, nature is wearing her finest just for you. And that's pretty amazing. Just as every book is not worth reading, it's true that not everything in history is worth preserving. Emerson would have been the very first to agree with my dismissive colleague who grumps about history and old stuffy theology. But sitting here today as we are, it is precisely because of our dismissive, grumpy old ancestors that we get to choose whether or not to stand on our own feet or stand atop the shoulders of the giants who came before us, the heroes of old, and reap that benefit because of their struggle, because of their work, because of their wisdom. Maybe we today get to see just a little bit further. And that's a good thing in my book because the view from up here is amazing. May it ever be so. Amen.
Visit us at UUSG.org.